Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual Agile Shift session. Before we begin, I want to inform you about a feature in the presentation that will make the session more interactive. Please make note of the question mark icon at the upper right of the presentation screen. Clicking that icon will open the question and answer feature, which allows you to send questions to our moderator that will be delivered to our presenter at the appropriate times. We are excited to present Drew Sheffman, software engineer at Disney Streaming Services, who will be sharing the other way to scale Agile. Take it away, Drew.
Thanks. So, as mentioned, this talk is called The Other Way to Scale Agile, specifically how you, as an individual, can incorporate an Agile mindset. Before we get started too deep into the conversation, I want to set some expectations. First, when I talk about Agile or Agileness related to this conversation, this presentation applies to all levels of Agile adoption. But for the conversation that we're about to have, I'll assume low to none. Also, when I talk about an individual can mean many things in this context. You could potentially be just yourself. It is you on a team of one. You could be on a team, but you feel like your teamwork or their teamwork doesn't meet what you want it to be. You could feel like you have a strong team, but maybe you're feeling a little bit more isolated with the new remote work that is upon us. Or maybe even you have a strong team and you just want to improve your own Agile skills for yourself. So throughout this presentation, I'll be presenting some ideas and concepts, and your mileage may vary. Some of the ideas require some persistence or creativity or courage, might be required to implement them. And just know that some of these ideas might not be for everyone. A lot of the information from this talk came from this book called Practices of an Agile Developer. I highly recommend this book. It was also one of the authors, Venkat, is a professor at University of Houston, so local as well. A little bit about me. Again, my name is Drew Sheffman. I have 24 years as a software developer, 20 years as an Agile advocate, 16 years working remote. I've been on dozens of teams ranging from 1 to 30 people, low to high performing, waterfall to Agile. And just so you have some of my information, here's my Twitter, LinkedIn, and my blog. This presentation will be available on my blog shortly after I'm done giving it. So diving into what we're actually talking about, this Agile mindset as an individual. To define Agile development, I will say that Agile development uses feedback to make constant adjustments in a highly collaborative environment. So breaking that down just a little bit, feedback in this case means information which is used as the basis for improvement. Constant adjustments, for this context, we will talk about adjustments as they relate to either the feedback or to the collaboration. And then finally, collaboration is the action or process of working with others to create something. Now let's talk about some of the collaborators. In this context, you might, as I said, you might be working alone or you might be working on a team that does not value a lot of collaboration. But you can still think about one of your collaborators being yourself and your future self. I think we've all been in the situation where we've created something and then 6 months later or a year later, we've had to come back to it and been utterly confused at what we were thinking about at that point in time. So whether you're talking about collaboration with the team or with somebody else, consider yourself as one of the yourself and your future self as one of the collaborators that we're going to be talking about. Of course, if you have a team, both current and future team, those will also be one of your collaborators. And obviously the business, the clients, the customers, whoever it is that you're actually making this software for is clearly one of the collaborators as well. So going back to this sentence, this Agile mindset, where Agile development uses feedback to make constant adjustments in a highly collaborative environment. Those three words, the feedback, adjustments, and collaboration, are going to be the structure around which this presentation lives. Before we get into that, I will review the Agile principles and how those will relate to feedback and collaboration. So as a review of the 12 Agile principles, 50% of them actually relate just to the individual. I've listed them here. Then they're in number based on what the number is on the Agile principle. So you can see that number 1 is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable working software. Number 2, welcome changing requirements. Number 3, deliver working software frequently. Number 7, working software is the primary measure of progress. Number 9, continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. And number 10, simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential. So out of these 6 things, you can see that 3 of them talk about working software. That's going to be important. A little foreshadowing there. Talking more about the Agile principles, 25% of the remaining principles, or 25% of the Agile principles, talk about the individual and the team together. I've highlighted them here on this slide. So number 4 is business and developers must work together daily through the whole project. Number 6, the most effective method of conveying information is face-to-face conversation. And number 12, at regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective and then tunes its behaviors accordingly. Now, I've underlined number 12 because though it talks about the team specifically in this principle, reflection and retrospectives can happen at an individual level, and they should happen at an individual level. So whether or not your team actually has retrospectives or not, you as an individual can still reflect upon how to improve and how to make more behaviors and more actions to make those improvements. And then finally, for completeness, the last 25% of the Agile principles are for management. I'm not going to bother to read them out to you because they're actually not relevant to the presentation. But for those of you trying to add up the math, now we're at 100%. So moving on to our concepts, we're going to be talking about how to get feedback as an individual, what kind of adjustments you can make as an individual to improve your feedback and to improve your collaboration, and then the different types of collaboration that you can think of for yourself and for your team. So let's get started with the feedback. Sources of feedback. As an individual, the most important one is going to be the code. Because it's the most important one, I'm going to say it again with a big picture and a large font. So the code is an important way to get feedback. Now, specifically, not just the code itself, but tests. Tests for code is the easiest way to get feedback if you're an individual. It's the fastest feedback loop available. Tests will let you know that your code is working, your code is failing, and it will happen really, really quickly. With your tests, it gives you the confidence that your code meets the expectations. So you have that feedback loop that you are solving the problem that you are supposed to solve. It exposes the unhappy paths and the edge cases. So on your test, you can explicitly define what happens if things go wrong, and does your code respond well to that? Again, providing that feedback of hopefully these unhappy paths don't happen in actual production, but in your test, you can prove out that what would happen and your code is responding. It also reveals potential couplings. Like if you're currently thinking in your mind right now that tests are hard to write because fill in the blank, that fill in the blank part is because there's likely that you have couplings in your code that are making it hard to test, where you have to set up an entire framework or an entire project to get your code to run. This could be an indication or feedback that there are ways that you could split up your code to make it easier to test. But overall, the biggest benefit to having tests is you have the confidence to go fast. So with having tests, you can then refactor as you want to. You can make changes, you can add things, knowing that you haven't broken anything. So actually, the goal of having tests is to get to a natural reflexive, and confident way to create or modify code. So whether you're adding code or removing code or just even refactoring, you have built in a safety net that allows you to go fast and know that you haven't broken anything. Again, creating a really fast feedback loop for the work that you're producing and the outcomes that you're creating. So going back to our Agile principles, as I said, 25% of the 12 Agile principles are talking about working software. If you're talking about working software and you have tests, then the tests are your sentries that are there proving that your software continues to work. So just by the fact of having tests and having tests that cover the code that proves it's working, you are 25% of the way of hitting all the Agile principles. So after tests, the next level of feedback that you can get from code is warnings. Now, oftentimes warnings are benign, like you forgot a semicolon, or maybe your line is too long if you have linting turned on, or there needs to be an extra space here. But I'll assert that you should treat all warnings as errors. Because if the warning is not actually a future bug, the best case scenario is that this warning is going to be a distraction. Whenever you build your code or whenever you run whatever's generating this warning, you'll have to look at this warning each time and validate to yourself, is this warning something that I should be concerned about or something that I should ignore? And if you ignore it, the next time you build your code and you see this warning, you're going to have to remember, oh yeah, this is the warning that I can ignore, or this is a new warning that I should deal with. So to avoid all of that mental reprocessing of warnings, treat all warnings as errors and see if you can resolve the warnings and get rid of them. That way you don't have the cognitive load of every time you build it to have to deal with these warnings. Moving on, outside of the code, if you do have a team, they are an excellent source of feedback. Now, depending on the level of teamwork that your team supports, you might have to go searching for this. One way is through code reviews. Now, you're probably thinking that if you are by yourself or your team is not doing code reviews, how can I participate in this? Well, hopefully there's still a bit of availability to read the code. Hopefully you're committing to a central repository and you can see the work that everyone's doing. If you are by yourself and you don't have a team that you can read their code and share your thoughts with, then find an open source project or a similar framework or a similar something and read other people's code, just to get a sense of like what standards are out there, what conventions are people using, what frameworks or tips or tricks or tools to create their software, to write their things. If your team is doing a code review or is doing code reviews, leverage that. Leverage the code reviews to really dig in and think about what they're writing and ask questions if they'll answer them, and really try to learn from other people's code as a way of getting feedback. Also with your team, hopefully you're doing retrospectives. I assume for this audience being in the Agile Shift conference that is likely. But if you're not doing retrospectives, as I mentioned before, you can still reflect and make personal improvements. You can still go through the process of how can I improve? What am I doing well? What do I wish could happen? And see if you can come up with that list for yourself of ways that you can improve. Now, if you do have a team and your team is not running retros, see if you can advocate for them. See if you can advocate, whether they're called retrospectives or they're called postmortems or they're called hanging out around the water cooler complaining. See if you can come up with some way of talking about how to make improvements, both on as a team, on a personal level, for the process, whatever it is, to have that change mentality, that improving mentality is really important. So our final source of feedback for ourselves is the business, the clients, the customers. And there's an asterisk on here because that should be pretty obvious that this is the people we're doing the work for, and whatever feedback they provide is probably the most important feedback because that is what they want. Now, the picture here on the screen is Snape in Harry Potter saying obviously. And I wish I could say obviously as well as he is in this scene from Harry Potter. But hopefully with the picture here, you can just imagine Snape saying it as brilliantly as he does. So those are the three sources of feedback. Again, the code is most valuable as an individual because it's the one that will talk to you the most. Then the team. Hopefully the team is in a place to give you feedback, but if not, there are ways around that. And then obviously your customers and clients. And so now for a quick anecdote. I was trying to have an anecdote between each of these sections, between the feedback and adjustments and collaboration. And I realized that tests as an anecdote make for very boring stories. So I could tell you about the time that we once had a bug in our deployment process where we accidentally released to production some code that never went through QA. But it was fully covered by tests and no one really noticed or cared because it worked, because the tests all worked. I could talk about the time that we went to add a new feature and we had looked at this line of code and thought that it wasn't being used. We couldn't find any references to it and we deleted it. And the test immediately warned us that that was a bad idea. And so we put it back. And yeah, it makes for boring stories, but the code ends up working. And I guess that in itself is a valuable story. Okay, moving on to tactical adjustments. And again, I'm going to try to limit the adjustments and things to do relative to feedback and communication. So the goal of any of these adjustments, any of these takeaways that you can have, is not to actually get to the improvement itself. It's just to move the needle and increment closer to the improvement. So going from a big step to a slightly less big step is our goal. Because some of these things might take several iterations, might take months, might take a lot of work. And the goal is to just, again, shave off an increment or two to get closer to that goal. So we'll be talking about the code a lot because as an individual, you and the code are tightly coupled. The code is the communication source. And whether you're an individual or whether you're on the team, the code is what we're all communicating about and around. Because it is the only thing that is enduring. It is the product. So whether you're on this product for 6 months, or whether you're on this team for 6 months or a year or 2 years, the code is the thing that is consistent with all of that. Teammates can come and go, the project could change, but whatever is there, the code is what's doing it. And it's the only accurate form of communication because it is. Documentation might get out of date, marketing materials might not reflect accurately what was built, but what was built is what the code says. So as the communication source, it is actually read, and I'm talking about read by humans, not read by machines, read by humans, orders of magnitude more than it is edited or written. You can kind of think of the mantra from construction where you measure twice, cut once. For coding, we probably read the code 10 or 15 times before we go in to edit it, just so we make sure we really understand it. So the readability of the code and the comprehension of the code should be the highest priority. This is, of course, the highest priority after you have working code. So our Agile principles say working code is the most valuable thing. Clearly, I'm not superseding that. But after that, readable, comprehensible code should be the highest priority. So again, circling back to tests, with tests, you can actually declare the intent through your intent through the tests. So we have readable code, and you have tests that are not only executable, they're trackable with your repositories, and they're always an up-to-date form of documentation. With the test, you can declare what the code should be doing in an executable form that's trackable, and it lives with the code. If your tests start to fail, that means that they're out of date with the code. So if your tests are up to date and your code is working, your communication source remains accurate. Moving on from there, other adjustments that we can talk about is to the process itself, the process of creating this application and creating this code. So there should be a tension between integrating your code into the whole app and isolating your code from the whole app. And as I said, it's a push and a pull, and it's a tension. So you want to attack the problems in isolation, but integrate the solutions continuously. By definition, there's a linear relationship between the speed of integration and the response of potential feedback. Basically, what that means is if the code that you're working on is integrated into the main app, there's a chance that you can get feedback from it. So frequent integration will surface issues early and successes early. Again, providing that fast feedback loop. And what this fast feedback loop can give you is you can keep your project demo ready. And what I mean by this is that you might not always be having a demo. Hopefully, if you're agile, you're having a demo at regular intervals. But if you're not having demos, or if you're not on an agile team, or if you're even by yourself, and the client comes to you one day and says, hey, I'd like to see some progress on this. If you can deliver a demo within a very short time frame, you would be able to get feedback from whatever it is that they want to see. If your project takes weeks to integrate, to be able to be demo ready, you've just missed an opportunity for feedback when they ask for it right then. So that's talking about the integration part. But the isolation part will help you constrain the context, allowing for you to solve a particular problem faster. So if you're working on a feature, or if you're working on a specific module, being able to isolate that from the entire app will give you faster feedback for that module itself, and will allow you to debug and develop quicker. And then you'll need to put that back into the system to integrate that. So again, it's this push and pull, this tension between integration and isolation for the process. The next thing about the process, another adjustment that you can make is tests. Back to tests again. You might be noticing a theme or a special bias of mine. So as I said, tests tell you a couple of things. First, they tell you that you didn't break anything. If you are doing a refactor, or if you're adding another parameter or something and your tests don't break, that's great. You can have some confidence that you didn't break your app. If you did break something, but you were expecting not to, that's a great thing as well. Like, oh, I thought this was going to work, but I broke something, it didn't work. And vice versa. If you didn't break something, but you thought you should have, like you added an important feature or a breaking change, or you changed a code signature and it didn't break, that shows you that you have a gap in your tests. And that's a good piece of feedback too. And then finally, like with your tests, it shows you that if you're adding something brand new, that what you added did work. So here's a way to think about it. Every time you touch the keyboard, your code changes. And it's the thing that changes the most. Now, when I say changes, you should also think in your mind, potentially breaks. So every time you touch the keyboard, your code potentially breaks. And tests are your change management utility belt. They are there to let you know that you did or did not break the code. Now, I'd be remiss if I was talking about tests and I didn't talk about TDD, or test-driven development. There's a lot of debate about TDD, and one of the things that I like about test-driven development is where you would write your tests first and then write code to implement your tests. One of the things that's nice about TDD is it provides a concrete reason to write your code. Again, going back to one of the principles of simplicity, the art of writing as minimal as possible. So if you write your test first and then write your code to pass the test, you are working towards that principle. And it provides a predictive validation to the implementation that you're making. So hopefully it gets to the point that, or even without tests, hopefully as a developer, there's a certain length of time that you go and you realize that you haven't run the tests, or you haven't run the code, and you might have written too many things before actually implementing it, before testing it. And this is irregardless of whether you have tests or not. I don't know if I'm the only person that feels that way, but maybe after 5, 10 minutes, a half hour, an hour of coding, I was like, I usually have to be like, I should run this. There could be tons of mistakes that I've built in here. And having tests just make that easy. I don't have to build the whole app. I don't have to run through the number of steps. I just run the tests and they tell me that I've made syntax errors or logic errors or whatever that is. So the biggest benefit to tests is the app is testable. I mean, that's the easiest way to explain it. It works as you expect, and it will alert you quickly if things break. Again, you have that fast feedback loop. That's a lot of me talking about tests in a section that should be called adjustments. So the takeaway from this is add and update tests on your project. If that wasn't obvious from all my discussion so far, that's the one thing to take away from this process. Because next we're moving on to adjustments that you can make to your mindset. Not just the Agile mindset, but to your mindset in general for working with code and working as an individual on a team. So the first thing to think about is changes and change requests, change requirements. In your mind, you might want to consider flipping the conversation to use changing requirements as feedback to improve the design. Now, whether this is a scope change or a new feature or a bug or whatever that is, whatever the change coming in, if you think of it less as a change or less as I didn't design for that or less as a hindrance and more as a thank you for the opportunity to learn and to improve and to make this better, that's one of the changes to the mindset that you can have, or adjustments to the mindset. Now, I talked about this one before, about keeping the app demo ready. And as I said, if you can demo the app on short notice, then who's ever asking for that demo is there to provide feedback. They want to see something. They want to see progress. They want to see whatever feature. They want to see that it's working. It meets expectations. Whatever it is that they're asking for, if you can provide that quickly, there's your feedback. That's exactly what you want. So you want to be able to have your app demoable on a very short notice. Another change or potential change to your mindset is to lead by example. So this could be that you might be the only person on your team who wants to write tests or who will write tests. You might be the only person on the team who considers change a learning opportunity, a growth opportunity. And to lead by example, you want to demonstrate the value and effectiveness, communicate and create a path for your team to follow. And this last part is important. So not just lead by example, but allow your team to follow you and to leave a trail for them to pick up. So if you are the only one writing tests, the hardest part about writing the test is writing the first one, because that involves the scaffolding and the framework and the execution of the test. And if you're allowed to check that in, then great. Other people can follow your path and write tests for themselves. The next thing about the next mindset that you should consider adapting is a vulnerable trust. Now, vulnerable trust is tricky to define, but it's basically being comfortable and quickly acknowledging without provocation your own mistakes, weaknesses, failures, and needs for help. It also recognizes the strengths of others, even when and especially when they exceed your own. Again, this is called vulnerable trust. And showing vulnerability helps others feel more comfortable about themselves being open and honest with their own concerns, questions, mistakes, and roadblocks, which ultimately allows for stronger collaboration. Again, this is one of the tough things to do, but with vulnerable trust and showing vulnerability, this is asking for help, asking for feedback, asking for advice, admitting your mistakes, admitting your, not just your mistakes, but your areas of improvement, and letting others help you. Some examples of this might be, maybe you've developed a solution to code and you've spent a number of hours, written several hundred lines of code, and you discover that you've taken a dead end, or it's not going to solve the problem as well as you want it to, or that it's not as readable as you want it to be, or you think of a better solution. To admit that you've taken a wrong turn, and to actually throw away this code that you've produced. As a developer, it's really like we get attached to our code really easily, but coding is really cheap, and it's really easy to throw away and recreate. And to get to that point of admitting that to yourself is an important step. And then also recognize that every comment or critique or code review is an opportunity to learn. And it's an opportunity to again, be vulnerable and to take that feedback and see how you can grow. Now, in addition to showing vulnerability, it's also important to react to vulnerability. Research has actually shown that it is the receiver of the vulnerability signal that actually builds the relationship. What I mean by this is, for example, if you're on a team and you say, hey team, I need some help, and no one responds to you, nothing happens, obviously. There's no relationship, there's no conversation that follows up, there's no growth or anything. It's actually the person that says, yes, I'm available to help, what can I do for you, that you now have established a connection and the relationship grows. So for you, if someone else on your team says they need help, or you can see that they're struggling, or you have determined in your stand-up that for whatever reason they are not meeting the goals that they have set for themselves, reach out to them, pair program, always jump in to help if someone else is asking for it. Another way to respond to vulnerability is even just to respond to simple questions. I know, like, especially now that we're remote and we're all on Teams or Zoom or whatever, someone like inevitably for a meeting is like, are we ready to start? And no one says a word. It would be good just to say, yes, I'm ready. You can start now. Like, just respond, because that person put out there this question that always ends up with this awkward, oh, okay, no one responded, or I see some head nods or a thumbs up. Let's, like respond to people, respond whenever they put themselves out there. And then just listen, be available for listening, be available for rubber duck discussions. If you're not familiar with the term rubber duck, as an individual, or as anyone, some research has shown that explaining a problem to someone else often helps you discover the solution to the problem without any sort of input from this other person. One of the suggestions that if you are an individual, if you are alone and don't have another person to discuss this with, to keep a rubber duck on your desk and explain the problem to the rubber duck, and that will often help you discover the solution to this problem. So the term has now become rubber ducking, or talking your problems out. Being available for a rubber duck session with somebody else is certainly better than having a rubber duck be your confidant in this discussion. Patience. The next adjustment that you can make to your mindset is patience. Change is hard. The whole Agile framework is around change, and we're still trying to adopt it 20 years later. So you might be doing all of the leading by example possible, and no one is following you. And that's okay, because you are doing what's right for you, making yourself more agile, improving yourself, and hopefully at some point in time, people follow you. And if not, that is fine too. It just takes some patience. Again, coming back to what the goal of all of these adjustments are. The goal is to move the needle an increment closer to the improvement, not to actually get to the improvement itself. Like there's no way to expect that all of a sudden everyone's going to write tests, or all of a sudden people will just embrace your ask for help or your desire to pair program. Again, moving the needle just an increment closer. So at this point, as we're finishing up the adjustments section, I want to remind everyone that questions take several minutes to process through the system. So if you have any questions at this time, go ahead and start to enter them in the chat. So when we get to the end, they will already be ready for that point. So, and before I finish off this section on adjustments, I have another anecdote to relay. So, now that we're home all the time, the kids are like, so what did you do at work today? And I was like, I'm working on a test that failed, and I'm really excited by it. And they're like, why are you excited about a failing test? And I'm trying to explain to them that it's so cool that my code is telling me that I made a mistake that, is preventing me from releasing this future bug. And they're not getting it. Obviously, they're in school, they're in elementary school and middle school. They're like, failing tests are bad things, right? I'm like, yes, for you, but for me, no. Because for me, it's told me that I've changed something. and that thing that I've changed, I need to adjust in the test and make the test pass, or the thing I changed is actually bad and I need to fix the thing that I've changed. So it's I don't know. It makes me feel anxious when I make a change and my tests don't fail. I get freaked out, especially if it's something that I expect them to fail, like I've changed the API or I've added a constant or I've added to an enum and the test didn't fail. I was like, I need to write more tests because I've changed the system and the test didn't cover it. It makes me feel weird. All right, moving on to the last section, our collaborative environment. So obviously we can't start talking about collaboration without talking about conversations. Now, as an individual, we likely will have some sort of stand-up or status meeting or regular conversation with the team or with management. If you are having stand-ups, and they're supposed to be Agile stand-ups, I want to remind you that stand-ups are for the team, actually, not necessarily for the Scrum Master or for the product owner or for management. You want to talk to your team about what your roadblocks are, what your goals for the day are. Are you meeting those goals? Like, it's not just a, here's what I did yesterday, here's what I'm doing today. It's a, I said yesterday I was working on this and I didn't finish it as I thought I would because of X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z is no longer a blocker, or X, Y, and Z is a blocker, and maybe someone can help me with that. Again, coming back to that vulnerable trust. Just keep that in mind as you are going through these stand-ups or regular conversations with your team or with your management. One of the sayings that, or one of the quotes that I like related to Agile, I'm not sure who actually said it, is stop starting, start finishing. So in terms of like conversations and keeping this in mind, see what you can do about actually finishing the work in progress. It's not just enough to throw it over the wall to QA. See what you can do about making sure it moves through QA to all the way done. And then, try to not pick up new work until old work actually gets out the door and is finished, to whatever your definition of done is. Other good conversations to have around collaboration is to be a mentor. And mentoring is not just as a senior person to a junior person. It is easy and acceptable to mentor someone your same level, to mentor someone higher than you. Mentoring, again, is just being there for that person, listening to them, sharing advice and experience. Everyone has different levels of experience, and everyone can be a mentor to anyone else. I remember talking to a person who I considered a mentor, who was many, many years senior to me. And I learned a lot from him and really appreciated everything he told me. It wasn't until a couple of years later when I was talking to him, we'd stayed friends even though we had switched projects. I was talking to him later, and he told me that like he learned more from our conversations about himself and about his skills and about things that he could do than he was even bragging that he probably learned more from me than I learned from him. So I never set out to be his mentor, but just by being a mentor allows for that exchange of information. And there's actually this good quote that says, knowledge is unique in the fact that it grows when you share it. Now, I was actually a professor at a university for 8 to 10 years, and I taught software. Every single semester, I learned something from my students, even though I was the supposed expert in the software. So I highly recommend being a mentor, sharing your experience with someone else. It's amazing what you can learn from everybody. The third part of conversations is to keep others informed. And again, this is sort of a well duh statement, but specifically announce early if you feel like your deadline or your goal or your estimate is slipping. And here's what I would tell my students, that oftentimes they would try to, like, the day of the project, the due date, the delivery date, they would say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't turn it in, whatever excuse. Now, I was really mean at this point. If you're telling me on the day of the deadline that you can't turn something in, there is nothing I can do for you. If you, almost every single case, you knew that this was going to happen. Your person was sick for many days before this, your whatever, you knew that you had multiple tests, whatever the excuse was. I was like, if you give me time before the deadline, we can make all sorts of changes. And how this applies, the example that I use for my students is like, say, for example, you're at a company and they have a hard deadline. You might not know that they have the whole legal department lined up on that day to review the product to go out to the public. You might not know that there's a huge marketing campaign going off right now that is going to promote that product on that day. So if you say on that day of the deadline, oh, I'm sorry, we need a little bit more time, you have affected a massive amount of downstream resources. But if you can come in as early as you know, a month or two early, and say, you know what, I'm concerned about our deadline, I think there's a risk here, then you allow the business, you allow the company to mitigate that risk as best they see fit and give them the ability to manage these things. Again, this comes down to that vulnerable trust of admitting that you might not make the deadline or you might miss your estimate or something like that. Moving on, the next part about collaboration is around artifacts. So artifacts are all the things that we produce. It's the code, it's the tests, it's the documentation, it's the stories and the tasks and the burn charts and everything else that we produce. All of these artifacts are an invitation to a conversation at whatever level. So we've talked about in Agile that the stories, the story cards, they are not the complete set of documentation. They are not the complete set of all the work that needs to be done. They are an invitation to a conversation. And I would say that this expands to everything, whether it's the code or the burn charts or whatever. Everything, use it as an invitation. Going back to talk about the code specifically, again, code clarity should take priority over excessive performance. And I put an asterisk on this because in some cases, you're going to have an SLA that says performance needs to hit these levels. And if you just determine that the only way to hit your SLA level is to make the code difficult to read, then that's what needs to happen. But in every other case, code clarity, readability, comprehension should be prioritized. And I want to say that creating readable code, creating simple code that's simple to understand is not simplistic. And there's actually a great quote from Mark Twain, which says, "I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead." And you'll find that it's easy to be verbose. It's easy to copy and paste. It's easy to over-engineer. The hard part is making simple code that works, that does what it's supposed to do, that is also easy to read. Next, with collaboration, outcomes. Probably pretty obvious, but the outcomes are most important. Again, we're talking about working software here. Disregard, credit, blame, intellectual prowess, code ownership, and other imposters. And just as an individual, focus on delivering the outcomes for the client. Get the software working, make sure everything's readable. Those are the things to focus on. A follow-up quote for this is that if you aren't making any mistakes, you probably are not trying hard enough. Again, this comes down to that vulnerable trust, to extend yourself, to put yourself out there, to make mistakes so that you can learn from them. The benefit of the mistakes, hopefully they're small ones, is that you end up with a better product. You end up with a better outcome. Next for collaboration is transparency. And under transparency, I see this as three different things. One, always report your time remaining that you have on the work that you're doing, not the amount that you have complete. I'm sure we've all been in that scenario where you've said, oh, I'm 90% done with the work. And then the next day you're like, oh, I'm 90% done. And then the day after that, you're like, I'm 93% done. And then the day after that, like, I'm 95% done. And you're never actually getting there. But instead of reporting like the amount done, if you report, I think I have 3 hours left. And then the next day, I still think I have 3 hours left. That allows for an easier conversation of like, what's going on? Why are you still having 3 hours left? Maybe it's just because you were interrupted with meetings, or maybe it's because you hit a roadblock. But reporting the time remaining, or the time that you think you have remaining, is a more transparent way of communicating this. Second, check in your work frequently. Make sure others can see your work. There might be modules that you're working on for a half a sprint or a whole sprint or multiple sprints, but make sure that you create check-in points, break points, just more places for feedback, right? If you've checked in your work and your team is doing code reviews, that gives you more opportunities to adjust your work before you get too far away. And then the third part about transparency is set a personal time limit for yourself for churn. I think everyone can kind of recognize when you are spinning your wheels or not converging or not making the progress that you expected to make. And it's at that point, again, returning to vulnerable trust, that you should ask for help. And maybe it's the fact that you just need to have a rubber ducking session with someone, or maybe have someone look over your shoulder to help you get through this roadblock. So again, these three pillars, this feedback for adjustments and collaboration as an individual, is what will help develop your Agile mindset. I want to remind you that questions are coming up here in a moment. They take a couple minutes to get through the system, so go ahead and ask your questions now as I explain one last story to go along with collaboration. And this is my most fond collaboration story. I was on a team, I was the only developer on this team. There was me, a designer, and a QA person. And I would start working on a feature, and about halfway through the feature, like I had the happy path of the feature done, and I would ask the QA person, I was like, is this what you expected? And he would like look over my shoulder, he's like, okay, click here, tab twice, and hit spacebar, what happens? I'm like, no one said anything about keyboard navigation. I was like, hold on, give me a day, I'll be back. So I go and I fix that, and you go, okay, so now we've done that. Click here, click here, click here. Again, I was like, that's not how I was hitting these buttons or going through this menu. He's like, I was like, okay, give me a day, I'll come back. So eventually we got to the point where we even before I started the story, he and I would collaborate. I'm like, how are you going to test this? What can I put in here for you? And ultimately, we got to the point where he never rejected any of the features, because we worked in such close collaboration that I knew how he was going to test it. I knew what the story had said. I knew how to implement it. I knew how he was going to try to make it break. And we just got to this point where it just kept working. It was such an amazing collaboration piece. There was even one where we had this data, this dashboard, and each cell in this data grid could potentially come from 4 different places, 4 different sources of truth. And I was like, how do you want to test this one? And we came up with this idea of holding down the, a magic key combination and hovering over it, and it would change color. It was just a styling change. So there was not any big code differences, but that change of color led to a key that said which data source it came from. And we could actually validate what the fields were. It was a great way of collaborating with that. So in summary, for this conversation, this talk, again, our initial statement, our initial sentence was Agile development uses feedback to make constant adjustments in a highly collaborative environment. You, as the individual, can strongly influence more than 50% of all aspects of Agile development just by trying to get more feedback and make more and have more collaborative discussions. And at this point, I will open it up for questions.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions. Are there tools recommended that help automate testing?
Yes. Every framework should have a tool set for automating testing. It depends on the language that you're in, depends on the environment that you're in. But yes, a simple Google search should help find some of those tools. Feel free to reach out to me if you want any of my feedback on specific ones that you find.
Okay, and then the next question. You mentioned that code tells what is built, even without documentation. What do you use to tell you what tests have been performed and the outcome of those tests?
So the question is, what tests have not been performed or what tests have been performed?
What tests have been performed and the outcome of those tests?
Right, so that's a tricky one. I mean, there's certainly things like code coverage, which might tell, which will tell like how much of your code is actually executed in those tests. I haven't found any good tools that tell you that your tests are good tests. And there's definitely good tests and bad tests out there. Again, tests should test intent. So you should be able to provide input and set the expectation and say, with this input, I expect this to be the output. Just having tests on their own is not an indication that you have good tests, although having tests is better than having no tests. I'm not sure if I answered the question as you were expecting, but I haven't found any tools that validate the how good your tests are.
Okay, that was the final question.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this talk, and hopefully you can leave some comments or feedback through the app.
Thank you all for attending today's session, and a special thanks to Drew Sheffman for a great and informative presentation. We value continuous improvement and your feedback. Please complete a survey for this session by logging into sched.com, locating the session, and then clicking the Feedback Survey button. The recording of this session will be available tomorrow. To view the recording, locate the session from your sched.com schedule and click the video stream button. We hope you enjoy the rest of Virtual Agile Shift. Have a good day.